The commons refer to resources accessible to all, or shared resources that are usually not privatized. Common resources are usually associated to livelihood and lifestyles in rural settings, such as fishing in the sea and rivers, grazing lands for livestock, hunting, gathering, and agroforestry in forest lands, and tapping groundwater. Common resources can also be found in urban settings, from salvaging garbage from dump sites for recycling, to building houses on public lands such as riverbanks and beaches, to providing transport services to the riding public, to gathering of drifting debris during a storm, to using roads, which eventually causes traffic, to available COVID-19 dedicated beds in hospitals, to waiting for your turn on the microphone during videoke. Other than sources of material resources, the commons can also be a sink, or resources that absorb the excesses. The atmosphere and the oceans as a carbon sink is the subject of climate agreements and debates. The rivers, lakes, and oceans serve as sinks from the effluents of agriculture, industries, mining, or even heat generated from power plants. Even land has served as dumping ground for our wastes. The problem in managing common resources has been popularly described by Garrett Hardin as the tragedy of the commons. The unsustainable use of a common pool of resources is because there is a failure to internalize the cost of using it. Because it is free, it will eventually be a free-for-all scenario. There is the competition mentality, wherein you think, if I don't get it, my neighbors will. There's the free rider problem. I don't have to help in managing these resources since the others are already helping. Or the insignificance of your contribution thought. It's just a small piece, so it won't do much harm anyway. The proposed solution of Hardin to the tragedy of the commons were privatization and government control. However, these are not the only options available. Actually, Hardin erroneously used the term commons. His example of common land was actually used for pasturing sheep and cattle that were managed sustainably by a collective. Hardin was referring to resources in an open access regime. But this erroneous example also highlighted another solution to address the tragedy of the commons: collective action. Collective action has been described as a group of principals who can organize themselves voluntarily to retain the residuals of their own efforts. Leonard Ostrom observed that the status of the commons is more correlated with collective action towards establishing community property rights rather than population pressure. Often, in natural resource management, it's not the natural resources that we manage, it's the action of the people that are being managed. Let's have a review of the different property regimes. Open access is when there's an absence of capacity to exclude due to ill-defined property arrangements. This is doomed to follow the tragedy of the commons. Private property is when there are institutional arrangements for exclusion, which are well established for individuals or corporations. The benefits and costs will accrue to the owner, providing incentives for rational exploitation. Public property is when resources may be used based on limitations of the state. Property is owned by citizens, used by some citizens, and managed by the government. Exclusion and sustainable use are not necessarily resolved. Because of the Regalian Doctrine, it established the responsibility to manage natural resources on the state as owners. But the lack of direct accountability leaves the community of users the burden of the impact of mismanagement. For example, in the open seas, since the Coast Guard or the Philippine National Police will not be patrolling the oceans 24/7, the small fisher folk will have to fend for themselves in managing the natural resources from illegal fishers or from commercial fishers encroaching the municipal waters. Another property regime is community property. This is where private property rights for a defined group is provided. Members have co-equal rights to use and prohibit the use of non-members. In all of these property regimes, the key elements are exclusion, transferability, and enforceability of rules. So if the strategy is collective action and the desired outcome is community property rights and sustainable and equitable resource management, what are the different factors for success for collective action? Ostrom originally defined 8 rules for collective action. This has been expanded by Agrawal into 32 factors. In terms of social capital, we can look at group characteristics. Clearly defined boundaries of the group. Exclusion and inclusion criteria of membership of groups are well defined. In politically challenging asymmetrical conflict, such as small fisherfolk versus commercial fishers, or indigenous people versus mining firms, the struggle is to capacitate the community to demand from higher level duty bearers to shift the power imbalance. Where there is a moral dilemma of symmetrical conflict, for example, small fisherfolk versus illegal small fisherfolk, the challenge is to strengthen mediation and dialogue capacities. Small size of the group. This appears counterintuitive to our desire to have mass movement building to limit the size for collective action. But small size is not about the number of members, but about how noticeable an individual member's actions are to the group. Size of the group is a balancing act of managing actions, reflexive communication capacity, and influence. Low levels of poverty. Poverty is a significant locality-based factor for collective action. However, there is no clear consensus on whether poverty leads to greater reliance on each other or increasing levels of wealth lead to greater use of common pool resources. On the other hand, extreme poverty becomes an obstacle for collective action. Heterogeneity of endowments. We have to recognize that members of the group do not necessarily have to be all the poorest of the poor. While we do have a bias for the poorest of the poor, it doesn't have to be exclusive, especially for the more endowed but supportive members. The mixture of differently endowed people allows complementation for collective action that requires both time, talent, and treasures. Homogeneity of identity. Identity is critical. This does not mean that they have to be identical in all matters, since diversity has its own value. However, the group must be able to find a commonality. How does the group identify itself? Who can identify with the group? Who can the group identify with? This will facilitate collective action. In terms of relationships, appropriate leadership. Appropriate leadership has been described by Agrawal as being young, familiar with changing external environments, and connected to the local traditional elite in the community. But more than individual traits, leadership is a relationship between leaders and followers that goes beyond the competence of the leaders. Trust is key and cannot be demanded by leaders. Trust can only be won by leaders by being trustworthy. You can become trustworthy by being competent, honest, and reliable. Interdependence amongst the group. The literature suggests that high interdependence among the group members lead to formation of institutions that promote sustainable management of resources. In terms of commonalities, shared norms. The members of the group should have shared norms in order to facilitate collective action. They should also have shared successful collective action experience. Past successful experiences of the community in collective action build self-confidence and trust among its members. In terms of natural capital, The management unit characteristics are: one, well-defined boundaries. Well-defined boundaries pertains to the clear demarcation of the managed resource unit. It is a given that natural resources do not necessarily respect political boundaries. However, boundaries define areas of mandate, responsibility, and accountability from communities. Boundaries define what resources you need to manage. It also identifies what critical resources are outside your boundary and the imperative that you have to build partnerships with other communities who have mandate over those essential resources. Small size of the resource. This indicates that the management unit must be manageable for the group, the managing body, and the enforcement unit. This is why community-based resource management is often described as small. While the need is for a larger size of natural resources to be managed to be sustainable, the alternative is to have a network of small managed areas by many communities. In terms of natural resource characteristics, one is the possibilities of storage of benefits from the resource. Not all common resources benefits can be stored, like clean air and water. The ability to store or harvest resources allows resource managers to account for and allocate resources. It also makes it easier for users to access information on the resource to be able to adhere to rules. Low levels of mobility. Low levels of mobility of the resource makes it easier to measure and account for the resources. It is easier to manage demersal fish that are territorial, like lapu-lapu, for small fisher folk, but it is difficult to control migratory species like tuna and sardines. Low levels of mobility also makes it easier for users to access information on the resources to be able to adhere to rules. Predictability. The ability to predict the flow of benefit from the resource and the volatility of the resource allows institutions to identify solutions for resource management and allocate resources. This is where participatory research comes in terms of yield and profit of their catch or produce.
In terms of relationship between natural resource and the community, first, there should be an overlap between user group residential location and resource location. Collective action is more evident in cases where there is an overlap or close proximity between the residential location of the group and the common pool of resource. Second, a high level of dependence of the group members on the resource system, such as if it's used in their livelihood or as a basic utility, rationalizes the need for the group to invest in managing the resources. Third, low levels of user demand for the actual natural resources or its fruits facilitate collective action. Lastly, users of a common pool resource must commonly perceive that allocation of the benefits is fair. In terms of technology, users and local institutions must have access to low-cost technologies that can regulate or exclude resource users. These provide managers more options in managing the common resource pool. For example, the simple barbed wire has been revolutionary in defining boundaries over land. Second, there should be ample time for adaptation to new technologies related to the commons. The sudden emergence of technologies that increases cost-benefit ratios, such as the surge in the increase of harvest rates, undermines resource management by displacing users with old technologies. It also creates a time differential for managers to recalculate sustainable yields and recalibrate rules for users to adapt to the new technology and rules. In terms of market, there should be a gradual change in the levels of market demand. There should be low levels of articulation with external markets. Integration of distant resource systems and users with markets usually have an adverse impact on resource management. Higher returns for goods pushes subsistence users to harvest more for profit, such as when the resources are being exported. Markets also create alternative opportunities for credit provision and other advantages that can substitute the benefits derived from resource management institutions. Markets may create incentives that can better dictate the choice of resource to harvest, the technology to use, and the harvest rate than the institutional rules. The gradual change in articulation with external markets also contributes to collective action. Natural resource management institutions often utilize market forces to design measures to reduce risks in resource use and sustain harvest rates. External markets allow individuals to specialize in various economic activities, to access credit and other services that can undermine efforts of local institutions in natural resource management. In terms of institutional arrangements, Ostrom mentioned that one should not talk about a rule unless most people whose strategies are affected by it knows of its existence and expect others to monitor behavior and sanction non-conformance. In terms of policy content and processes, rules must be relatively simple and easy to understand in order to avoid confusion and enhance compliance amongst resource users. Sanctions to violations of rules are rational and graduated in order to ensure that they are corrective in nature. The access and management rules are locally devised, suggesting high levels of participation from resource users. There has to be a corresponding match on the rules or restrictions on harvesting resources to the regeneration of the resources so that users will experience the benefits of following these rules and sustain their efforts in managing the resources. In other words, it has to be rational. There must be relative ease in the enforcement of rules for institutions to sustain monitoring efforts. The monitors and officials must be accountable to the users of the common pool resources in order to ensure that they perform their roles and responsibilities. And in terms of the judiciary, low-cost adjudication must be available to resource managers. In terms of governance, central governments should not undermine local authority. The efforts of local groups and authorities must be considered legitimate and not challenged by central government bodies. The levels of appropriation, provision, enforcement, and governance are nested. This means that higher level units of government has broader appropriations, provisions, enforcement, and governance. It would also help if the external sanctioning institutions, such as the Coast Guard or the Philippine National Police or DNR, must be supportive of the efforts of the local institutions. Sustainability of collective action has long been associated with the ability of institutions to continue operations without external aid. However, literature also suggests that appropriate levels of external aid is needed to compensate local users, who are mostly poor, for conservation activities that are not usually generating sufficient income to compensate livelihood opportunity losses. When we map out all of these factors, this is what it would look like. Is it too complex to be useful? Take note that this is not necessarily a formula for collective action, but just a collection of lessons and enabling factors. Each context is unique, where specific elements have more weight, and they become stimulating causes to affect other elements. Also, recognize that the collective action theory uses a rational institutional arrangement approach. The premise is economics. People engage if the net benefit from rational use of resources is more than the cost of collective action. Of course, people would do collective action for a number of other reasons, like a good heart or caring for other neighbors. But the collective action theory merely uses the arguments of the tragedy of the commons against self. What are your thoughts on this?